Like most people my age that grew up with games, I was a big fan of the Tony Hawk series. I started with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 on PS1, and it blossomed from there. I next played Tony Hawk 3 on PS1 while drooling over the PS2 version in magazines. Then I played the original game on N64, finally got to play 3 on PS2 a couple years later, played Matt Hoffman's Pro BMX somewhere in there as well, on top of both the original Dave Mirra, the remix version, and the PS2 sequel. I started skating, blading, and scooting in real life. Then my heart was stolen by Street BMX, though I still loved skating. I read Tony Hawk's biography in 2001. I drooled over every game that had an extreme sport component, including stuff like Kingdom Hearts 2's skateboarding or the BMX and GTA San Andreas. About the only game I didn't play until later from that era was Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, because I didn't really know anyone who had it, so I didn't really play much of it until 2009. Underground 1 was where I really fell in love though. This was my favorite Tony Hawk all this time. Sure, there was a short period of time where I preferred Underground 2, but the focus on skating Underground 1 had, instead of mayhem, always held my heart more strongly. Honestly, despite everything I'll say going forward, that's probably still the case, although I haven't played through anything but Tony Hawk 1+2 in quite a while now. So, when I head back to the others with my current more critical lens, that might change. I do remember adoring the Burt Slide in American Wasteland, for example. Going back to Underground 1 was filled with nostalgia, obviously. Whether it was playing split screen with my younger brother for ages, replaying the story mode dozens and dozens of times, or making levels and filling them with goals with my best friend, I spent so much time on this game. In particular, I played a ton of the GameCube version. And overall, I would still argue this game is worth playing through. As we'll get to, it's clunky, very simple, and in some ways has aged like milk. But it's also a quick game to finish, and most of it is a fun little ride if you set your expectations by recognizing it's over 20 years old at this point and was made in just 1 year. The main story of Underground 1 follows your created character as they try to become a pro skater, and eventually try to recapture the reasons they loved skating in the first place. Along the way, you'll run across real-life pros, quirky fictional characters, quite a few cringy stereotypes that don't really hold up today, travel the world, and prove you're the future of skating as a culture. Alongside you is your best friend, Eric Sparrow. To put it simply, Eric is a little shit, and what start out as seeming minor mistakes and overzealousness turn into transparent backstabbing, as Eric decides to put becoming an ultra-wealthy pro skater over both friendship and skating itself. The crux of the narrative centers on a video clip you and Eric get about halfway through the game, in Hawaii, where you gap from one rooftop like 10 stories high to another one below, doing a McTwist over a helicopter. When that clip is supposed to be shown off to thousands during a big pro skater event though, mysteriously Eric is the only one in the video, giving the impression that you didn't do a damned thing in Hawaii. Eventually, you get stranded in Moscow, and barely escape hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt from Eric stealing a tank and you trying to stop him. He escapes, you get caught, and you're in big trouble at that point. But you make your way back home to New Jersey eventually, figure out why you started skating in the first place, and end up thrashing Eric in one last skate battle. You get the video clip back, and finally, there's no denying that you're a legendary skater that will one day rival Tony Hawk himself with your influence. We'll talk about the storyline itself later, but this is probably my favorite story in the Tony Hawk series. It's the one that resonates the best, while not showing its age as much in regards to content, which is an issue games like Underground 2 have, since they try to channel fads like Jackass more than actual skate culture. I know the two were briefly kind of synonymous, and that kind of chaos is present in a lot of the most legendary skate videos, but skating is generally a better focus for a skating game where your primary mode of interaction is skating, you know? While that stuff can be a great time capsule, games of that ilk can also lose their long-standing appeal. In terms of the core pacing and the key events, this story works, and for Neversoft, this was absolutely the most comprehensive story that they'd told up to this point. It's still absolutely pedestrian in many ways, and does still show its age here and there. There is more than one instance where you're doing nonsense like gathering women or otherwise prepping for a party, for example. Not a great look when the game itself is only like 5 hours long at best. But it's also not trying to be the Citizen Kane of extreme sports game narratives, so there's a limit to how much it matters when the game deviates from skating and skate culture in order to have you find your teammates when they're all hungover from partying the night before or whatever. I don't want to suggest the game's narrative isn't clunky. It very much is, but when it works, it works. That's kind of the way I'd describe the gameplay too. While it still largely feels on target, responsive, well thought out, and polished for this era of Tony Hawk, there are also bits that feel undercooked or mildly broken. Certain aspects of it were just far harder or more finicky than I remembered. At first I wondered if part of the issue was just that I was that rusty at Tony Hawk, but then I remembered Tony Hawk 1+2 exists and I can play that just fine. I've beaten it like a dozen times at this point, so while I'm not as good at these games as when I was a teenager, I should still be capable enough because I'm not actually out of practice. No, I don't think the issue is me. I think the issue is indeed a relative lack of polish in the game. All of the little frustrations I felt back in the day flooded my brain as reminders while I played. The habit of holding the ollie button down all the time to maintain speed or prepare for obstacles, for example, could cause issues when I'd have to let go of it for a lip trick. Sometimes the game ignores the ollie command just fine. Sometimes it tries to activate both the ollie and the lip trick at once and causes my character to bail. Certain Flatland tricks can be cancelled, and others with extremely long animations can't. And when I say the Flatland tricks can be cancelled, that's what I mean. If you time it right, it cancels just part of the animation. If you time it wrong, it'll cancel the trick as well, meaning if you're not careful, you'll spend valuable balance time just starting tricks without actually executing them far enough to get points or in addition to your combo multiplier. Meanwhile, others just can't really be cancelled at all, so if you press the wrong combination out of habit or whatever, you might be sitting through 2 or 3 seconds of animation for a single trick. This doesn't have the biggest impact on lower difficulties, but on Sick, it can be the difference between success or failure for a goal. Basically everything off your board is a bit clunky as well, in particular the camera. You can either sprint or walk, and your character makes big, sweeping direction changes, while the camera struggles to follow. It makes precision on foot when sprinting around surprisingly difficult, or if you choose to walk instead, so slow that it's painful. Your character will also sometimes just not grab ledges properly, and many ledges that you'd think are grabbable aren't flagged as such. Sometimes your character will just bail when starting a grind from a manual. Sometimes your character auto-rotates, and sometimes they don't. Collision on launching surfaces and ramps can sometimes be a bit broken, so if you wait just a split second too long, the game will treat it like you just ollied off of a flat surface instead of an incline. There are a lot of little things like this, which elicit little huffs of annoyance on the normal difficulty and below. But if you're on the normal difficulty or below, it's really not a big deal. The game is largely fair as long as you stay away from Sick, which we'll discuss in a bit. This isn't the only thing that's broken about Underground 1 either, unfortunately. Flatland is hysterically overpowered. The same sort of thing can be said for grind transitioning on rails and lip transitions while lip tricking on the coping of a ramp. But balancing lip tricks is harder to maintain, and for rails to be as effective as Flatland, you have to have access to a circular rail of some kind. The game rarely has a score goal or combo goal of any sort that cannot just be blitzed by Flatlanding. This is actually a rare occasion where I would have sided with the people who argue, just don't abuse it then. The trick expression in these games is a core part of the depth and enjoyment the game offers. Pulling a standstill manual and then just mashing face buttons is intentionally about as boring as you could possibly imagine. And while whether something is boring or not is very subjective, Flatlanding still takes its own type of skill. Not a ton, but balancing for long periods of time isn't always easy. Not to mention, the most optimal way to flatland here roughly mirrors real flatlanding anyway. The potential justification for balancing balancing the game this way is weak, but it is there. The reason Flatland still ultimately feels broken in an unsatisfying way, then, is that it's an effective way to avoid all of the problems outlined above. When you try a goal a dozen times in a more inspired and legitimate way, but you get hung up and bail while trying to lip, or you randomly under-rotate because your character tried to auto-rotate in the opposite direction, or you don't adequately transition from one rail to a parallel rail surface, so you drop your combo, you just want to say fuck it and spam Flatland. When you've got a simple to understand option that removes all of the frustrations that can unfairly punish you when engaging in other systems, and also ends up being more effective than those other systems, it becomes a crutch. Doubly so with how ridiculously messy the balance is on Sick difficulty, the hardest difficulty. Sick sucks. I was going to finish that as well for this video, but I just couldn't. Some of the goals are tastefully expanded in Sick, like the ones that ask you to complete a line or do something in a time limit. Those lines are longer, and those time limits are more strict. When someone is calling out specific tricks, they're often more complicated and varied. The difference in some other goals, though, are barely noticeable, meaning they end up painfully simple. That does mean that you're not suddenly going to be ripping your hair out on a goal that tasks you with driving a car or something, but it already starts the difficulty off in a really uneven state. And then still other goals dotted around are so much more difficult than on the other difficulties that they feel straight out of a Kaizo mod or something. Some just feel like they didn't quite have enough testing, like the San Diego one where different grinds are called out and you have to hit a rail back and forth. There are more tricks and it calls for more complex grinds more often. If you do one grind per launch, you will run out of time for the last two grinds unless you get really lucky with duplicates though. But you also can't just combo the second to last grind into a manual, hit the quarter pipe, revert, and then manual back, because you likely won't have the speed to get back to the rail. So instead, you have to get off your board during the combo and then get a run up back to the rail. It's a case where this goal on Sick feels under-tested, and it sucks when otherwise perfect performance can lead to a failure. This is a small issue, but still one of those things that's more annoying than necessary. Then you have stuff like the mini Hawaii competition. The trees and other junk in the way are frustrating enough in such a small area, but for whatever reason the scores needed here to ensure victory are far higher than you needed in the Tampa Am. We're talking over double, to the point that even nearly 850k was only worth a low 90s score, despite having a fraction of the time most Tampa Am competitions offered, less to trick off of, and therefore less ability to maintain good trick diversity that would keep your points bonuses high, and having to deal with the brutality of 6 tougher balance meters and such. Not only do goals get harder on Sick, but the requirements for stat growth get far harder, and your balance meters and such are more finicky. You also can't land sketchy tricks near as easily. In essence, with less time but higher score demands in this competition on Sick, you're expected to do roughly 8 times as well as you were required to do during most competitions in the Tampa Am, with less options to trick off of. And while your stats are a bit higher than they were back then, it doesn't in any way make up for the difference. Another goal I loathed was the Tampa goal, where you have to wall plant a raised bridge and then manual down a hill and around the corner. I love these type of spot goals that are hyper specific to a level's design, but the hill can't keep your speed up well enough, and turning the corner while maintaining your manual is kinda brutal. If it ended there, fine, but then you realize you're not even really halfway there, and you'll have to maintain a spacewalk through a couple more sets of cones that nearly lead you all the way to the half pipe boat dock. Especially with the stats you'll have in Tampa upon arrival, and even with your stats after finishing it and getting sponsored, this is all but impossible for mortal players. Yes, you can come back to these goals after maxing your stats out later in the game, but the difference in balance performance is marginal on Sick compared to how it scales on lower difficulties. It sucks because I really appreciate how in-depth they got with the adjustments to the difficulty itself. Having longer lines, stricter time limits, suddenly needing to combo between points you simply had to hit before, or even having lines change, are all really interesting shifts that could have elevated the difficulty immensely. And at points, it does, but I have no clue how I beat Sick as a teenager. I only did it once, and I know I didn't cheat, but holy shit, how in the world did I do it? I don't think you need to modify the goals like this and make your balance meters and landing proficiency so much more unstable at the same time. One or the other, or better yet, allow us to alter character difficulty and goal difficulty separately. Maybe I want to play the Sick goals with normal stat requirements and balance challenge. And that only gets more frustrating because while normal has its moments of challenge, as a whole I found it far too easy. It was still just challenging enough most of the time to not feel like I'd baked my brain in the hot desert sun, but I wanted something more. I was frustrated when lines I was supposed to hit were too short on normal, when I could see more of it ahead and wanted to try and tackle it. I was frustrated when the timer was 5 times too long, or when half the objects I'm supposed to wall plant or whatever are on street level. All of this isn't to suggest that Thug 1 is a bad game. It still holds up in a wealth of important ways. I'm not sure if this started with THPS 4 or not, but the goal diversity here is far stronger than in the classic style games. Since the goals on each level in those games were roughly the same, you didn't get line-focused goals or gap-related goals near as often as you do here. More than ever, Underground asks you to find specific ways to interact with and explore the environment. You start to be able to notice individual spots that can form cool gaps or lines, instead of just ramps that give you access to predetermined spots. The levels here are also all diverse, and I'd say for the most part there isn't really much dead space in any of them other than the final unlockable level you get for beating the game. Most aspects of the skating also still feel snappy and responsive. It generally does feel good to skate here, even if sometimes the game decides to sneeze in the middle of your combo and send your face crashing into the pavement. As most people say, the soundtrack here is great, same with the sound effects, and I think the voice acting is solid, including from the real-life pros. The aesthetic is less successful. At the time it was fine, and levels in particular look nice, but going back to the game after so long, I was struck by how uninvolved and flat most of the story stuff feels. People love to say that THPS 4 is basically the prototype Underground, and that's not wrong in a way, but in saying so, I feel like they often oversell how involved the story of Underground is. It's supposed to be the major differentiating factor. And yes, you get a handful of cutscenes that really matter. The ones with Stacy Peralta, the early one where Chad Muska gives you his board, the one where Eric betrays you, the other one where Eric betrays you, also the other one where Eric betrays you. These scenes and several others that get real direction and animation are solid, but they're honestly few and far between. The rest of the time you're kind of just standing around with a couple of text boxes and canned animations before you start a goal. These use the lower quality models as well, which don't look great blown up to modern resolutions. This in and of itself isn't a problem, but it does make the game feel unexpectedly anemic when you stack it up to the cutscene direction in other higher budget games from that era. Goals in general can also either feel kind of nonsensical, or feel like filler that I'd classify as neato for the time, but are honestly dreadful wastes of time now. It was cool to be able to drive cars in a Tony Hawk back in the day. It's not cool anymore. Likewise, goals like grinding a car 5 times in a row so that it can make girly sex noises is also a waste of my time. The one upside to this scene and goal simplicity is that, voice acting aside, you can effectively make goals that are just as complex in the custom goals system. But that's not much of a consolation for me, since it's not like anyone else is ever going to try my levels or goals for a 20-year-old Tony Hawk title. Underground also has a tendency to consolidate several of the same types of goals back to back in the same level or even the same chapter. The illusion of variety is paper thin here, since we've been spoiled by quality context for otherwise simple puzzle objectives in modern games. So these days, you can't help but notice when the game basically says, find 5 objects and touch them 3 times within 5 minutes. It's not that the goals are bad in cases like this, rather it feels unfocused and sloppy when they're not more spread out. I also personally loathe the fact that most of the time a chapter requires you to do all but one goal, even on sick. Make me do half of them, or make me do all of them, but having to go back to a previous chapter or even a previous level over and over and over again just to pick up one stray goal each time it forces me to progress is so silly. At least on the PC version with the clown job fix, loading times are so quick that it's absolutely a minimal frustration, but it's also unnecessary and likely serves as a spotlight on the extreme time constraints these games were made in. The character creation is still okay, and I still personally get a kick out of the different menu themes from the various sponsors, as well as the custom board creation system. Custom tricks can also be insane, but are cool if you're into that kind of thing. Going back to Tony Hawk's Underground 1, I was prepared for a game that felt a bit clunky. I was prepared for a game that was a bit ugly and a bit thin. I was expecting some goals to feel like gimmicks. While these aspects have aged poorly, I think they really only detract from the game so much. I still enjoyed the vast majority of my time with this game, this time around on normal. It's far from perfect, but most of the fundamentals are still there. It wasn't until I got to sick difficulty, where I'd fully prepared to get my ass kicked, that I found the game much more frustrating. Going from a goal that's so easy I can turn my brain off to one that's a really creative expansion on the requirements normal had, to one that's so difficult that it feels like total mastery, cheating, or throwing your controller are the best solutions, isn't a great time. Yeah, get good or whatever garbage, but I want it known that a more evenly paced version of Sick and or an option to differentiate between how difficult I want goals and controls would have left me delighted. More polish and attention to make sure the goals felt like they escalated as smoothly as they do on normal would have transformed how I felt about this difficulty, but instead it felt like they got halfway to perfection, halfway to hell, and then ran out of time and had to ship. Still, if you're looking for a return to some Tony Hawk style arcade skateboarding action, this is a great option even today, as long as you temper your expectations and prepare for a bit of jank.